My guest on the Rush Friday feature won the Boston Marathon in 1983, was the last American to win the Boston Marathon until 2014. His win in Chicago in 1982 was the last person born in America to win until 2017. He set American road racing records in the 8K, 10K, 15, in the 8K, 10K, 15K, world records in the 10-mile run and the 25K. Good morning, Greg Meyer. How are you?
Not bad. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. One of the things I always ask my interview guests is, tell me about your state, why it's so special. Give me a sales pitch about Michigan. Why is it such a great place to live? Such a great place to live.
First of all, it's 4 seasons. You appreciate every one, although come February, I cannot get tired of winter. But it's the water. Between the Great Lakes, the rivers, and the inland lakes, it's just amazing. So I'm a fly fisherman, so it doesn't get a whole lot better than living in Michigan unless you can. It's just a great state. There's so much to see and do here in every season.
We are joined by Greg Meyer on the Rush Friday feature. Greg, at a certain point, about 15, 16 years of age, most people sort of figure out their abilities athletically or in other areas. What about you? At what point did you realize you had average running ability?
Probably not until end of my sophomore year of high school, beginning of junior year. Sort of the light went off. You know how you go back and you point to one thing. I got third in the mile my sophomore year at the state Class B meet back then. And I remember the race perfectly. And I remember making a decision with about 300 yards to go, to just go. And I moved up from well in the back of the pack, as most sophomores would be, to ended up getting third. And I thought, you know what? I can do this. And I had some great coaches around me that did nothing but encourage that.
You went to Michigan, and what was that transition like going from the high school level to college?
Humbling in that you realize there was a whole lot of guys that on paper had as much talent as you in high school. I was scared my freshman year because I had mono during the summer between senior year and freshman year and really didn't for a number of weeks, and then came back and I bounced back fast. And by the end of the season, I was the number one runner on our team. So things went well, but it was a rude awakening in terms of the academics as well as the competition within the team. We had a coach at the time who liked to foster internal competition as opposed to working together. That changed after my freshman year when Ron Warhurst showed up. Totally different mentality about coaching.
You did a sub-4-minute mile. What was that like? Were you obsessed with that number?
I wasn't obsessed with it. It was one of those things where when you were growing up in the 60s and early 70s, your idols in distance running were Jim Ryan, Marty LaCory. They were amazing, and they were milers. So when I got really fit, that was my first year out of college, still living in Ann Arbor, and things were just going well. Warhurst said, let's take a shot at it. So, and got under. It was not as hard as I thought, although I never did it again because I really never focused on the mile. Yeah, it was just one of those things. I still remember the workout leading into it. He said, we're going to do repeat halves until you can't do anymore. And there was another kid on the team that was still on the team by the name of Steve Elliott. We got through like 6 of them, you know, at running under sub-2. And we finally looked at each other and we said, I think we should stop. So we hit the next one in 2:01 so we wouldn't have to do anymore.
Did you feel during the race that you could do that?
Yeah, I did. Most, I think, at some point in their career have these periods of time where they feel they can do anything. And that was one of those periods where I felt I could do anything. I'd made the transition from college to post-collegiate, and just things were clicking for me really well. What was funny is I led the whole thing. So we were out even splits. I think I died a little bit on the last 200 because I was out there alone. I was 2:57 with a 400 to go and ended up running the 62 last quarter. So that was my slowest quarter. But yeah, I kind of felt like, yeah.
Your college running didn't exactly pay the bills back then in the 70s and early 80s. Your decision then to move away from Michigan, tell us what you did.
Well, I was a janitor for a year in Ann Arbor to sort of support my running habit. I was Bo Schimbeckler's janitor in the football building, and I was a janitor at a local restaurant early in the morning. So I'd do one shift early in the morning at the restaurant and then another shift at night over at the football building, and I'd run and go to grad school in between. The opportunity to move to Boston came because I met Bill Rogers at the World Cross Country Championships. And I was lucky enough that my college coach, who is still one of my best friends, said, I've taught you about all I know right now. You've just been invited by arguably the best distance runner in the world at that point, Bill Rogers, to go join him. He said, the only thing I ask is if you learn something new, let me know. So off I went to Boston and got a job in Bill Rogers' store. It was sort of the welfare state back then. You went to work for a shoe store so you could keep training. To train with Bill Rogers gave you tremendous confidence to race pretty much anyone in the world because he was the best.
Leading up on the win you had, the whole atmosphere, it's incredible, isn't it?
Boston is the Mecca. It's sort of the holy grail of marathoning, and it's because of the tradition. And I have to say, the Boston Marathon, the BAA, does a tremendous job of nurturing and keeping those traditions alive, which makes old guys like me feel relevant once a year. There's no race that I've ever stood at the start line and felt just tingling that I'm at the start line of the Boston Marathon. It's a different experience. And for those people who are talented enough to qualify or to charity, it's just a special race. The crowds are amazing and knowledgeable. You know, these are crowds that come out generation after generation and sit in the same place that their parents took them to, and they know what's going on. It's just an incredible experience.
Do you remember your feelings as you crossed the finish line? You see so many runners who are on the verge of collapsing. You see guys who are just so emotional, they break down, they're crying. What about you?
I still remember the thought running through my head that life is going to change. This is a different thing. I'm not naive enough to not appreciate the fact that Boston athletically wasn't my best race of the year. I was just really fit. But I knew it was the most important race that I'd ever won, simply because of the media attention and everything else, and at how rare it is for an American to win it. When I won, there was only 7 Americans who had won since World War II. In the last 35 years, there's only been one. That's Meb Kopletsky. It's kind of a rare occurrence for an American to win. And it's where I sometimes have issue with some of the younger guys coming up now is we never talked about how fast we were going to run. We only talked about how you would win. And it was about making surges and what things I would have to do during the race. So I thank Benji Durden, who got third that day, for setting it up beautifully by just taking it out from the halfway mark. It made it a 2-man race versus a pack race.
You've talked about race psychology and about running scared and being an insecure runner. What does that mean?
I always felt at times where if I waited too long, the doubts would creep into my head. One of the things that gave me confidence to run was the amount of work that I was able to do going in. My workouts gave me tremendous confidence. But sometimes, like all people, the longer you wait in a race, the more doubts creep into your mind. So oftentimes, especially on non-marathon events, I'd go to the front and push and make it a test of fitness right from the start. Usually it narrows it down to 3 or 4 guys that think they can win, and all of a sudden now you're in a manageable position. I can race 2 or 3 guys, whereas that lack of confidence led me to like being out front pushing, oftentimes right from the gun.
There's a fine line between being an elite athlete and then you start to decline. You can see that little by little. Could you see that happening? And then how did that influence your whole feeling about running and being able to compete?
For me, I think the marathon actually caused my career to end earlier than it probably should have. The minute you win Boston and Chicago, everybody assumes you're a marathoner. You assume you're a marathoner. So when injuries start to creep in, which I never had early in my career, but I started to have some after Boston, and you try to jump back on that marathon merry-go-round to get right back at it, and it just leads to a spiraling effect of more injuries. By the time 2 years, 3 years after Boston, you sort of realize that you're never going to have the same health and had before. Had I not run marathons as often as I was doing, which was only 2 a year, but I was bigger. I was 150 pounds. The average weight of these guys now is 128 pounds. So it beat me up. But once I came to the realization, it was not a hard decision to retire or to be mediocre. So when I felt I couldn't be elite anymore, it was okay to let it go. There's only a few regrets in a career. Most athletes remember their losses more than their victories. You know, not making an Olympic team was probably the big void for me. Yet I was given the gift of winning Boston and Chicago. So in the scheme of things, I'm okay with it.
We've got some questions from some of our listeners. Mark from Georgia, he's run 16 marathons, 29 triathlons. This guy does a lot. He's on his bike all the time. The sub-2-hour marathon was not a record due to the technical assistance. Who and what course do you think will have a legitimate marathon to break 2 hours?
The one that has the best chance of doing it legitimately would be Berlin. It's a flat course. They set it up, and it's a loop course so that it qualifies. London's another possibility. Boston, they'll never give you the record because of the downhill elevation, even though the course itself is probably harder than most flat courses. But I would think one of those two, Berlin or London, because they could set the stage. I do think we're a ways away from a 2-hour marathon in a competitive situation. Hopefully, because there's drug tests that really drives me crazy is the new shoes that they have out there that are giving guys an advantage of 3 or 4%. I don't think that's fair. That's like hitting a juiced baseball. I have problems with it. I have no doubt that eventually somebody will break 2 hours, but I don't think it's going to be right away.
Brian has a question. Brian's run two marathons. What level of running and competition do you do right now at your age? You'll be 65 in September.
Very little, actually. I've had an Achilles problem for a couple of months, which I think now they've identified more as a nerve injury out of my back, which had nothing to do with running. It had to do with moving a piano years ago and blowing it. I do a lot of walking. I'd like to get back to running, but it wouldn't be for anything competitive. It would just be for health and wellness, and both mental and physical wellness.
Eric's run 7 marathons. He's run a 50-miler also. He says, with such an impressive and lengthy list of accomplishments in your running career, which among them would you say was the most gratifying?
I don't think there's one. I think there's a few that when I look at them, I see them as elevating my confidence in what I can do. Like I mentioned, my sophomore year of high school, that was a transitional thing. Getting 5th at the Nationals sophomore year of college in the steeplechase, that was transitional. I don't think breaking 4 minutes was transitional, but some of the things that were going on the roads when I moved to Boston, where you just had these great races, winning the 25K race in Grand Rapids and setting the American record, that gave me a lot of confidence. So it's not that elevate you to the next level and you stay there.
Carl, who's a math professor at Penn State, so he knows a lot about numbers, Greg, and trying to talk him into running a marathon. He said as a young man, he ran a 1:22 half marathon, a 10:50 for 2 miles. So I'm trying to talk him into running a marathon, but nonetheless, he's got two really good questions. You're one of the very few people in history who have run both under 4 minutes for the mile and under 2:11 for a marathon. And tell us what it was like making the transition from shorter races to the marathon and how your speed remained an advantage when you moved up to a longer distance.
Great question. Only 10 or maybe 15 guys that have ever broke 4 and broke 2:10. And surprisingly, I was the first, and I never became aware of that until later in my career. And now it's sort of a point of pride for me. I think the speed helped me win Boston because it allowed me to run the downhills, effectively. I don't know that the speed has ever come into play at the end of a marathon for me. When you get to the end of a marathon, it's sort of the distance has evened the playing field between those who are just strong and those who are fast. And if I had to choose between the two, I would choose strong over fast at the end of a marathon. And being a mathematician, he'll appreciate that even in a 100-meter dash, usually the person that you see accelerating at the end of a 100-meter dash is the person that's slowing down the least. because it's about strength. So I don't know that the speed helped me per se in the marathon. I think it did in the shorter distances, but in the marathon, the only advantage I think it had was when you wanted to cover a move that was faster than pace or really the downhills of Boston.
He has another question, and by the way, Greg, I should pretend these are my questions because it would make me sound more intelligent, wouldn't it? His other question is, could you tell us a little about, and I think this is a great question, tell us a little about the differences in the culture of running between the heyday of the 70s and early 80s and today.
Boy, you could go on for hours about that. I think in the 70s and 80s, we were creating a sport on the roads. I remember that we formed athletes back then that was pushing for prize money. We were pushing for drug testing way back then in the early 80s. The Cascade runoff led to some of us being banned from the sport for taking money, which led to the tax trust system, which ended up opening up the sport altogether and opening up the Olympics. So it saddens me that we don't have a better history of our sport like they do in baseball and football. I think it was more fun to be an athlete back then because we were creating things. There wasn't so much the money in it, although money was involved. You'd go to a race like Gasparilla in Florida, and it was a party. You ran hard. Nowadays, I think it's more, you've got your trainer, you've got your sports psychologist, you've got your nutritionist. It's changed. You know, there's fewer elite athletes, I think, now because it's just all changed. And I don't know that it's, quite honestly, I don't know if it's as much fun as it used to be a generation ago.
Final two questions come from cross country coaches and track coaches. Tabitha, interesting, she sent me an email and she said it's just rather ironic that she was talking to her team about training and much of what was built from the running boom of the late 70s. And she talks about fartlek runs, hills, the Warhurst, Michigan workout, how that formed the foundation. And now we have running watches, apps, nutritional supplements. The point she's saying is that you guys formed the basic foundation. Talk about that and how you can combine those two things to have more consistency.
I do think the foundations that we used, and Tony Revis, who does a lot of interviews with folks, he made the point, like in our generation, we just knew intrinsically what we needed to do. Now they have all the science behind it, but it just proved what we were doing probably wasn't wrong. Most of our stuff was based on linear. Now, we didn't do the same seasonal type build periodization that he did, but the basic principles were linear. It was gathering strength. I think the watches and the GPS, they keep you honest. They let you become aware of your body a little bit better, where I think we just sort of had this gut feeling of when we needed to rest and when not. I remember the first time I saw Rob DiCostella wearing a heart rate monitor. And I asked him, do you use that in training? And he said, only on the easy days to make sure I don't go too fast. And that made sense to me because when you get really, really fit, it feels easy, but you're working hard. And I think the technology can be there to help guide you to know when to rest and know when to back off. And the other part of that is, it was the sad part of our college days is we had an 8-mile loop and a 10-mile loop. All of a sudden, when Map Your Run came out and everything else, the 10-mile loop was really closer to 9. And it's like, no wonder we thought we were running fast.
Final question comes from Paula, who's also a Final question comes from Paula, who's also a cross-country and track coach. She says she's struggling with this. She looks at the time trials of her cross-country girls and what they're running is very slow. And she says, how do you teach young runners to adjust speeds while running? They get stuck in the same pace. Are there any specific drills?
Go from the back to the front. Your job would be to surge to the front. Then you'd wrestle a bit, and the last guy, then they surge to the front. Bill Squires, when I was getting ready for Boston, we did a lot of surging. So if you're out on a normal run, you've got to up the ante for a minute or two. No different than fartlek. You train yourself to go hard for just a minute or two. And I think if you can convince your athletes to say, hey, listen, if you're in the middle of a race with somebody, if you can just go harder for 30 seconds, chances are that person's not going to want to go with you because they're going to think they're fitter than you. But it's building their confidence up, but also training runs that utilize those surges. They don't have to be long, but it's that change of gear. You get it rolling because you don't want to let them come right back at you. So you surge for 30 seconds, then you go right back to pace, if you've gapped them by 15 or 20 meters, you don't want to slow down and have their momentum keep that base pace going at least for a few minutes until you actually break the string between you and the runner behind you.
Well, we've been serious talking about running. Let's get to a funny or bizarre story from all your years of running.
Okay, so those folks on the East Coast that live in big cities. One of my good friends who sadly passed away a few years ago, Tom Fleming, great marathoner. We were at a Bill Rogers running camp up in the White Mountain. We were out on a run through the trails. We came across two moose. And I don't know if you know this or not, but moose are some of the, I guess, is the most deadly animal in North America. Most deadly animal in North America. Probably because they end up through somebody's windshield when you hit them. We come across these two moose in the woods, and he looks at me and he goes, "Let's chase them." And I'm like, "No, you go chase them. I'll watch from behind this tree." But the funny stuff, most of it I probably couldn't repeat out on runs, and the things you share with your teammates that just get you laughing so hard you can't stop.
Finally, Greg, what's the future for you?
The future. I want to get back into some kind of shape so that I'm not a slug. And if that means biking more than running, so be it. I love trail running. I've got some work goals. I'm the chief community officer at Metro Health, University of Michigan Health here in Grand Rapids. And we've got a building to build and some other things. And I want to help get that done before I sail off into retirement and find myself standing in a river fly fishing for hours on end.
Thanks for joining us on the Rush Friday feature. Appreciate it so very much. And we'll talk down the road, maybe a year from now, and you can talk about your training schedule and getting back into it as you hit 65 and, of course, Medicare.
Hey, I had to sign up last week. What a devastating experience.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you very much.